Then, and we'll go with roll call.
Teresa, we don't have any copies of the agenda.
That's from the city.
Sorry. Okay, let me get situated here. All right, Member Rockwell,
Here.
Member Sperlingwood, Member Crow,
Here.
Member Covey,
Here.
Member Paul,
Here.
Member Fultz,
Here.
Member Morse is absent, and Chair Jacobson.
Here.
Okay.
All right. So,
And so next, we have adoption of the agenda.
all right.
I know it would be helpful if you could actually see it, and I do apologize. But I know I sent it. So, as Mr. Cunningham said, the agenda consists of adoption of the agenda, approval of the minutes, which we don't have any minutes this week. And we're not going to talk about the state of the utility,
gonna
right?
have a few
Oh, you are? Okay, so the state of the utility, and then our business discussion items will be the presentation.
Move to accept the agenda?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Passes.
Okay, thank you. No,
So, and we don't have minutes.
Correct.
So next is state of the utility. Thank you.
So,
Takes a village.
Mr. Chair and members, there's been a lot of activity in the last couple of weeks relative to the utility, and I want to just provide a little bit of context to that and sort of what's been going on, and then I can answer questions or we can talk through that. So, most recently, one of the local delegates is proposing or has put together a draft bill, local bill, for an independent utility board. And so what a local bill is essentially, it's a bill in the legislature that only applies to our area. There are several, so I'll talk about that in a second. There are several other bills that have been proposed. Legislative session just started. There are several other bills that have been proposed that could impact the utility. And in a future meeting, I can give an update, as we go through the legislative session of what those are. So there have been several bills, but this local bill that has a draft has been put out for an independent board. That independent board would have 5 members, and essentially all of them would be appointed by the governor. That is the kind of the meat of what that is. There has also been established a special a committee meeting of those local delegates next Friday, which is March 17th. To file a local bill, you have to have a meeting where the local delegates just have a meeting to discuss that. It could be as simple as they call the meeting to order, they say, hey, we're going to do a local bill, and then they end the meeting, or it could be as more complex with public comment and things of that nature. That will be in Tallahassee on March 17th. Myself and others, I believe the mayor and maybe others will be attending that. Our city commission through the General Policy Committee today has expressed the desire that if there's going to be something like that coming, that it's something that the voters should have a voice in. So they just expressed the desire for, similar to what happened in 2018, which was a referendum to the citizens of Gainesville of whether we should have an independent board. So that is what happened in 2018. The voters voted to not have that. Several of our commissioners just expressed the desire for that to be put to the public, and even the openness that it would be beyond the citizens of Gainesville, but also customers that are outside of the city limits. So that was kind of the discussion today at GPC, but there's no official action by the city commission. And again, this local bill hasn't been filed yet. It has just been a draft has been put out of that language. So I'll open up to questions and as best I can to answer.
Yeah, John.
Who are the delegates you're referring to?
Yeah, so they're delegates that are either representatives or a state senator that represent some portion of our area.
Okay.
And so they are Senator Perry, Representative Clemens, Representative Bradley, Representative Henson, and Representative Brannon has a small part too. Like each of them kind of have these small parts of this area.
Supposed to be, it's local, right?
Correct,
Supposed to be.
right, correct. But it's kind of like little weird pieces.
Would that, would the GRU still be an enterprise fund with the city? How would the independent board versus advisory board interface? Would the enterprise, the GRU still be an enterprise fund?
Yeah, so great question. So we haven't seen all of the language of the bill, but
Yeah.
from best to understand, it would be you'd have this appointed independent board that they would have then the authority of rate setting, what the GFT would be, and be able to then make those decisions. They would have that authority as opposed to the city commission to make those decisions. But the utility is still, I'm looking at, it would still be an enterprise fund and still owned by the city of Gainesville.
Okay.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Okay, I'm just, it's all new to me. Okay.
And it's kind of new to, I mean, this is all
Yes, I know.
very real time.
So is there a chance that it wouldn't be decided by the local voters, that they could be imposed on us, basically?
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, so the legislature has the authority to make that it's not required to go through a referendum. That with a local bill, they can put a local bill forward, they could then approve that in the House, it can go to the Senate and be approved, and then then it would not require that. So I think the commissioners were just really reaching out and saying, we think this is important that you have the voice of the people in it, but there's not a requirement, to the best of my knowledge, there's not a requirement at all that has to happen.
Okay. And so not to go into any great detail, but imagine you guys are aware, at least at some level, of the many things going on. There's discussion of deciding that the city commission has been fiscally irresponsible in having the mayor and the city commission replaced. There's talk of potentially selling the utility. There's talk of this. There's talk of saying, because it's serving areas outside the city, GRU would now be under the auspices of PSC. So there's a, did I miss any?
Well, so there's some bills that have been filed that have to do with if you provide service to customers outside of the municipal limits, that the PSC should be part of the review. There's bills filed concerning surcharges for customers outside and limiting that. Again, the legislative session just started. Those are bills that are out there, and I can provide more details of that kind of in the future. At this time, I know in general sort of overviews, but I don't have a lot of details on that at this time.
Tony, are there other jurisdictions that have a similar type of structure? And it sounds like a mini PSC.
Yeah, so there are some examples are like JEA has an independent board, OUC in Orlando has an independent board, Kissimmee Utility Authority, that's an independent board. So there are examples of this and of that structure, and that's what we're kind of right now kind of looking at some of those structures, but ultimately, this would be something the legislature would do, not GRU or the city of Gainesville. This is an action by the legislature to establish this.
When I attended the APPA meeting, it seemed like a lot of these boards are independent. I was talking to somebody and they said, what? Yeah, so I'm just pointing that out. So
Yeah, I think there's examples of both, right? So
Yeah.
there's examples of municipal governing boards similar to like what we have here,
yeah.
and both. I'm not sure the statistics on throughout the
No,
state, but yeah, I think there.
But I was just saying that there are a lot of people at that meeting that were members of independent boards, other than city council members and all that other things.
If you look at the PSC, they have a whole staff of people who do nothing more than look at rates. What do you call it? Where do they find the people to actually understand enough about the utility and make rates, what do you call it, from these boards?
Yeah, so and I want to be careful because I read it briefly, so I don't know, but there were some qualifications in the bill, and again, it's a draft, it's not been filed, so I say a draft bill, but it's not been filed or anything, but in that language, there's some qualifications for the picking, for what those 5 members would need to have, but ultimately, it was very explicit that the governor is appointing those 5 members, but there was some criteria of what the experience or background of some of those positions.
But even people on a PSC don't have those kind of
Right.
backgrounds. They have a whole staff of people that do it for them.
Right. Yeah.
So this is pretty unprecedented. There's a lot going on.
There is a lot
It'll be
going on.
an exciting year.
I'll just make the comment that, in my opinion, this is an independent board. A bunch of bootlickers appointed by the governor is pretty much the opposite of an independent board.
Thank you.
I have a question. I mean, to what extent, like, and I know we have the legal representation here, but to what extent, like, is there any precedent for what is being proposed in this local bill? Because it strikes me as just like straight up theft, to be honest. I mean, you're taking a organization, an entity that is owned by a particular, democratically elected body, and saying, we're going to take that from you, basically, and give it to the governor. And I don't understand how, and I know that, legality and constitutionality is not really pressing in Tallahassee these days, but I'm just, how is this even like not bizarro world that we're talking about here?
The main issue is that the legislature has wide latitude to implement laws that change how a municipality is governed. And the governor also has discretion to change the way we do things. It is unprecedented because we haven't seen it before, but it's legal.
It's
The
legal.
way that the laws are written and, excuse me, the way that our statutes are written that govern how a municipality is formed. Yeah.
So any municipally owned utility in the state of Florida could be seized by a local delegation and given to the governor. I mean, is that basically like, you're saying this is legal?
Yes, but they wouldn't call it seized.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the governor, in slight defense, wouldn't have rights to the assets of it, but he would.
We'd have rights to appoint the people that can control the assets.
Yes.
So,
That's correct.
I mean, I've seen what that looks like at, working for Santa Fe or UF.
Yeah.
I mean, it's de facto control.
But
So,
control, yes.
And has there been any conversation with FMEA? Are they taking any kind of a stand? Because, I mean, I would, this kind of a threat, I think, would be to all utilities in the state of Florida.
Yeah, so, Mr. Chair, I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable because, these things are happening real time. So I don't want to get into a lot of depth. We are working with industry groups like FMEA and our city attorney and looking at what are our options and directions that we can go in and reaching out to the delegates and things of that nature. So I don't want to speculate too far and go too far, but I will just say we're looking at what's the best approach and options going forward, and how can this be done in a way. Obviously, my goal as a general manager is make sure that we're able to continue to provide utility service locally to our customers and our community. And so how the best way to navigate that and make sure that continues. So I wanted to give you guys an update. I wanted to provide, this is what we know now, but this is all happening. That the draft bill was just, I think, last night or the night before. And so I want to let you know that's happening, but there'll be more to come as we kind of understand more in the next couple of days and weeks that I can kind of give a little more detail.
Okay, I appreciate it.
If the bill does get out of the committee and goes to the House, could you provide us a draft copy of that? So,
Absolutely.
yeah, so at least let us.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
And we're trying not to speculate too far, but it's very concerning. And
Yeah.
I suspect there seems to be a direct correlation between the difference in the city's political leanings and the governor's political leanings and the aggressiveness of these kind of approaches.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm speaking to is sort of the uncertainty of the things we know, and I think as we gain more certainty, we can have more further discussion about that as
Yeah, and
well.
definitely, keep us apprised and let us know what we can do to support what's in the best interest of the city.
Is a local bill voted on by the entire House and Senate?
Yes, so this is me just hearing from other people that are more live in, swim in those waters, that yes, it is. It has to be voted on by the full House and the full Senate, but typically folks, support what happens at a local level because it doesn't affect the rest of the members, and so you oftentimes get unanimous or a lot of support for a local bill from the rest of the bodies.
Thank you. Anything else on the state of the utility you wanted to?
No, that is the big thing.
That's the big news of the
kinda
day.
happening now. And then in the midst of that, we're still, I want to make sure it's clear for you all and our customers and everybody. In the midst of all of this, we are still operating well as a utility, providing service, focusing on providing our core service well, but also understanding that what's happening here and making sure we're navigating that, but we can't lose sight of continuing to do our business and do it well, which is why, we're still having this meeting. This can't stop everything that we're doing as a utility. We have to continue. And so we didn't want to cancel this meeting or other meetings. We need to move forward and keep making financial transactions and providing power and water and wastewater and natural gas and telecommunications services.
Well, I just have one question. If this would happen, what would happen to all the employees and the pensions? And, I mean, this is huge for the whole community.
Yeah, so the idea is you'd have an independent
Horrifying.
board. So you just would have a different governing body. So you would still function as a utility, you'd still do the business, but you would have a different governing body than the city commission. That is what's in that draft bill language.
And to Teresa's point, so like pensions and stuff are covered by the city of Gainesville. So even
Correct.
if whatever happens to you, you disappeared. Not that I'm saying that's happening. People's pensions and everything.
So again, I don't know all the answers to all these questions, but right now the city of Gainesville would still own the utility. It would just be under the authority of a different board for whatever elements are in the bill that gives that authority to the board.
I was just thinking of all our friends and neighbors and fellow people around and how this could be a lot of difference for them in the future.
Potentially it could, yes. We don't know the answers though, so I want to be careful about, kind of how to characterize that. I mean, we're going to continue as a utility. We're focused on that. And we're focused on working through this process to make sure we can continue to provide service, maintain, the employees and everything that we're doing at the level that we're accustomed to.
And I do appreciate what you're saying, that you're trying to navigate, captain a ship that's where you still got to keep the ship running as people are kind of losing their minds. As someone who deals in an industry where the swipe of a pen threatens us at least every year or two, it's tough. And so again, we want to do what we can to support and to keep people from, keep the ship running, and we'll figure it out. All
I
right.
guess my question is if that's the intention going forward, why don't they just turn everything over to the PSC? Rather than make the PSC, do them for all of them, as well as investor-owned utilities.
Well, that's what one of the bills that's been filed would do. It would put all.
I mean, if that's what they want, if that's what the legislature wants to do.
I don't know if there's one to do them all. I know there's, if your territory.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Extraterritorials. Yeah, there's a bill that talks about if you have extraterritorial customers or customers outside of your municipal boundaries, that then you would, the PSC would have some authority over the rate making and oversight of those utilities.
All right, are we ready to move on from this one? I'm sure there will be further discussion
Yes.
and hopefully clarification. But yeah, it's a big deal. Don't in no way mean to minimize it. Claudia, with that lead in, you want to take it from there?
So yeah, so Mr. Chair, so the item, we are, as you all know, we are in budget season, which lasts a long time. We try to really spread out different topics, so we're not trying to absorb everything all in one sitting. This topic, we went to the city commission with this. Do you remember the date, Claudia?
February 15th.
February 15th, we went to the city commission and presented this information, and so this is that same information. There's no action on this. This is just providing information and allowing for questions. There is a lot of information here, so we're gonna walk through it. It's similar information every year. So if you've been here before, you've seen some of it before, but we're gonna walk through it kind of quickly, but if you have questions, we can pause and address those. So with that, Claudia, take it away.
Thank you. Claudia Rasnick, Chief Financial Officer for GRU. This is the first budget workshop for the UAB for the 2024 budget season. So similar format as last year where we were splitting up the topics because they are quite dense. So this one is on debt, the debt portfolio review, and the cash liquidity and reserves. So before I roll into the presentation, one of the primary topics that has been surrounding the bill and the board is the outstanding debt at the utility and the conversations at JLAC. So I'll touch on a little bit when I get into some of the slides as far as some of the activity that's been going on lately. Some of you have seen this before, so sometimes I have a tendency to talk pretty quickly, so if you need me to stop, ask questions, just let me know. The latter part of the presentation, the cash liquidity and reserves, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Benton to perform that part. So, let's see. So utilities such as GRU, JEA, OUC, they're capital intensive. So the capital infrastructure in and of itself at GRU is a 5-system utility. It's electric, water, wastewater, gas, and telecommunications. And it takes a lot of funding to fund those capital assets on an annual basis. So we are what's considered capital intensive. So there are a lot of dollars that are used to maintain that infrastructure. And we have to maintain that infrastructure in order to continue to provide services. It's services to the customer base, but also to make sure we're achieving the revenues to essentially pay back the debt that the utility has incurred in order to provide those services and keep that infrastructure in place. So as part of that process of maintaining the infrastructure, issuing debt or bonds to get the cash to actually build and maintain the infrastructure, the rating agencies have a part in this. And we've talked about this before as far as what rating agencies do, what they look at when they come into the utility. They look at the metrics of the utility, the financial metrics, which we'll cover later, but they also look at the age and how we are maintaining the infrastructure. And that is extremely important for the reasons that I mentioned before, is that we have to maintain the infrastructure to earn the revenues to pay back the bonds, and it's a circle with the utility. With GRU in and of itself, the amount of debt is extremely high. We're highly levered. We've talked about that in the past, but we still have to maintain that infrastructure each and every year. So sometime in April, we come to the commission in the UAB to talk about issuing new money, and what that means is to receive cash to maintain the infrastructure at the utility. So the September 22 financials, they are currently with the auditors. We expect for them to be issued by the end of this month. They were a little bit later than what I'd expected. We're waiting on some information from general government, but we'll be able to issue on time. So what you're seeing are the numbers that you'll see in the financial statements, the $1.8 billion in net capital assets. So total utility plant and service across the 5 systems, $3 billion, less accumulated depreciation and amortization, 1.3. Construction in progress, those are projects that are currently in progress, like literally in progress. People are building them, adding to them as 106 million, so our net capital assets are 1.8 billion. To fund that type of infrastructure at those type of dollars, we're in the capital markets, which means we're issuing debt to investors about every 2 to 3 years. We run calculations internally to make sure that we are maintaining our infrastructure according to prescribed guidelines. So our annual capital budgets are running about $75 to $85 million. Recently, the The capital budgets have been north of 100 million because of the CIS, the Customer Information System, and AMI. Those two projects, plus the gasification of Deer Haven, have pushed those capital budgets up on a temporary basis because of those major projects. But typically, it's about 75 to 85 million dollars, which equates to about 4% of our total capital assets. So our annual depreciation expense is $100 million. What you would normally see in a capital budget is your capital budget is replacing the infrastructure at the same rate that you're depreciating it, that you're using it. So GRU is running slightly behind, as you can see, roughly 15 to 25 million as far as keeping up with that infrastructure. The utility, for the most part, runs 50% equity and 50% debt. Sometimes it'll shift to like maybe 55-45, depending on the mechanics that are working behind the scenes. But what that means is GRU is collecting operating cash dollars during the year to fund the infrastructure. Like 50% of that 75 to 85 million are coming from current rates, and the other part is coming from debt. That keeps the debt from rising as fast. You wouldn't want to do 100% debt and not collect some of those dollars from customers, and this is pretty normal. So Moody's, this is a snapshot of one of the agencies as far as how they look at the condition of the infrastructure. And so you can see that the electric system is 19.24, so rated an A, so that's good. Water system is 16.31 and wastewater 16.99. Gas is running a little bit behind, and GRUCOM is further to the right. So it's just an additional reflection that the capital spending is not keeping pace with the capital needs. Given that DHR, the biomass plant, is such a large portion of the electric system, we went ahead and calculated the removal of DHR just to see what the capital infrastructure would look like, and that's 15.95. So the 50-50 split between equity and bonds makes sense for another reason. It's called intergenerational equity. If we, the utility, charged current customers the entire amount to fund the infrastructure, we're essentially charging current customers and not future customers. So by issuing a portion of it in bonds or debt, it spreads those costs over a 30-year time frame, so each generation is paying a portion of the asset infrastructure that they're using. And we have been coming before the board and the commission for the past couple of years for refunding transactions. So you will continue to see us come forward with that. As we have opportunities to reduce interest costs, that's what we will do. So the debt is a significant portion of GRU's total budget. So what you see on the slide are the percentages. And so for the debt service for FY23, it is $104 million. For 24, it's $108 million. You can see the O&M costs are at $150 million and $154 million. Typically, you wouldn't see debt service of that size. You would probably see it somewhere in the $25-40 million range for a utility of our size. But the buyout of the PPA is what's created that outside debt service. Fuel is a pass-through. You'll have a presentation later on in the budget season as far as the fuel. Mechanics and Eric Walters will be providing that. For those of you that have been here for a while, you'll remember that fuel is a direct pass-through, but O&M, debt service, UPIF, and the GFT go straight to base rates. UPIF is the 50% equity that I was speaking of that funds the other part of the capital asset infrastructure needs. It's Utility Plant Improvement Fund. And so those are the dollars that I described earlier that were coming from operating dollars. They move into Utility Plant Improvement Fund, which are used for capital needs. And then the general fund transfer. So you'll see the general fund transfer for 23 is 34,283, dropping to 32,283 per the agreement that the charters and the commission have to reduce the general fund transfer by $2 million a year through 2027. The percentage that you see on the screen, the 7.41 and the 7.25, there's always a conversation or a thought that percentage is in line as far as a GFT as a percentage of revenues, and it is. It's normal. That looks just fine if you're looking at other utilities. The issue at GRU is the size of the debt service that we have to cover, the $104 million or the $108 million that also has to pay out of current revenue dollars. Any questions so far? Okay.
What does UPIF stand for?
Utility Plant Improvement Fund.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So this is showing the components I just covered, but by system. So see the electric system, a debt service, water, wastewater, gas, and GRUCOM. You'll see a higher percentage of debt service in the wastewater system due to capital infrastructure needs in the wastewater system.
See, real quick, we have a question,
Yeah, I had a question.
and thank you for using the light.
On a slide before this one, the debt service. If the general fund transfer wasn't there, would the debt service be more in line with others? Would that help anything?
It would help, it would not completely mitigate it.
I just wondered how big of a factor that was.
That is a great question. We're going through those calculations now as far as what that would look like. Mr. Manager, do you mind if I talk a little bit about, okay. So it's part of the conversation with JLAC, and I'll get into this a little bit later. The plan at the utility, for those of you that have been here for a couple of years, we put in a cash balance reserve policy back in 2019 to put in the reserve target floors, and then last fall, what we call the debt defeasance policy, and essentially financial metrics were put in the fall, and those created a band for cash. So as cash was moving above the reserve targets, the policy gets triggered and it starts to move towards either debt defeasance or not issuing as much debt. And so the projections over time were that the reserves were going to be over those target levels within our planning period, and we could start to defease the debt. But as I've described in many meetings, the debt it's moving up. It'll move up to roughly $3 billion by 2030. So the debt defeasance with the dollars that are available was only going to slow the slope. So instead of going like this, it's going like this. That debt was still rising. You can only pay down debt if you have enough dollars to pay down debt. So the plan that the commission and the board put in last year were base rate increases in the electric system and wastewater, $2 million reduction in the GFT. Then you have your bands as far as your cash reserves, your debt defeasance. But as JLAC told staff and the management and the commission that were there, that's not near enough. And that's what we're currently working on, is trying to figure out what those dollars are. We've been running calculations for weeks as far as what that actually means. And so once we get closer to that, we'll come back to the board. But to answer your question very simply, the GFT is not enough. It has to be base rate increases as well. So, and it also depends on the time frame of which to deal with that, because you still have to fund the utility. We have these conversations internally. So what happens if you don't fund the utility for a year? Well, that's a very dangerous thing to do. You should not do that. You have to fund the infrastructure. You have to maintain the infrastructure. And it's not just the capital dollars that maintain that infrastructure, it's the O&M dollars. When we've been through the budget discussions in prior years, you'll see more of this in May, a lot of the O&M dollars are fixed costs, right? So they're labor costs. You know, there's not a lot of non-labor that you can pull out of the utility without starting to impact things. But we are looking at possible expense reductions because, you know, we do need to, you know, tighten our belts and see what we can do to actually bring down that debt load. But that's primarily what JLEC was saying, is you need to get the debt down, possibly lower base rates, but it's difficult to do both because they all take dollars at the end of the day.
Okay.
Thank you. I think most of you have seen this slide before. So up till roughly 2005, the utilities debt was pretty flat, like right around $500 million. It moved up to $900 million through a couple of projects. One was the Eastside Operations Center. Another was as the utility was preparing for the biomass plant to come online, there was like an air handler put on Deer Haven to deal with the environmental emissions. The software system for FMIS was put in, and there was a couple of projects in the wastewater space. The biomass plant went online in December of 2013. So for context, I started with the utility in January of 2014. So the very next month the month that I started, we were talking about the biomass plant and the accounting treatment. And the accounting treatment, because that was the the one that had to handle all of that, the accounting treatment of the biomass PPA was a capital lease because the utility was the only off-taker. The way that the contract was set up, the utility was the only off-taker, so it was put onto the balance sheet as a capital lease. The rating agencies imputed that PPA as debt, so that's why you see those red lines up there. That is the biomass PPA coming on as imputed debt, and it was on the balance sheet as a capital lease. So fast forward, we all know the history of the PPA and the buyout of the PPA. The buyout of the PPA actually reduced the total debt at the utility, and that's where you see the drop in 2017 and 2018. So interestingly enough, I started as a CFO in January of 2018, and now I'm dealing with the impacts of the buyout of the PPA, and we had negative cash coming. And so that's when we put in the reserve policy and started to move forward to really stabilize the financial health of the utility. This has been a multi-year process. As you can see, it's been well over a decade. First, the PPA piece, the buyout of the PPA piece, and then trying to deal with the effects of the debt. So when we say that the GRU is highly levered, we are highly levered, but we've been trying to maintain it and reduce it as much as possible. So that 12%, that negative $233 million, is quite an achievement given what has happened at the utility. Remember, we're capital infrastructure, $85 million a year. We're issuing debt. We're trying to trim those debt service numbers and the outstanding debt by looking at whatever we can do to bring that down. I just said quite a bit. So
Before you leave that, just a quick,
Yeah.
so I understand, GAAP accounting, how you account for a PPA. Is that real? I mean,
yes. So
it's like saying, I guess in my mind, we know we're gonna have to buy fuel all the time. It's just we haven't locked into buying fuel. It's gonna happen. What, is it? I know it's treated differently, but is it real?
So at that particular point in time in 2014, and I'll talk about the PPA's imputed debt separate from the capital lease. So at the time that the PPA was being evaluated for a capital lease, the standards, the governmental accounting standards at the time had an exposure draft out there talking about PPAs being a capital lease. And so it was recorded as a capital lease. That runs through our audits, or external audited financial statements, and the auditors sign off on that type of thing. Now, PPAs are imputed as debt because essentially we're responsible for those payments.
Sure.
So when that contract was signed, GRU, or the multiple iterations, GRU was responsible for those payments, whether they took the energy or not. That's what really triggered the imputed debt piece. So we couldn't walk away. We owed those dollars, and that's why they ended up that way, as being imputed as debt.
Just one second. Jason, you had some?
Yeah. What would it look like if we were to take, because I think this is a really illuminating slide, like if we were to take this same thing and project out into the future with the solar PPA on there, how would that look?
So the solar PPA, I'm going to give you a rough number because we're still running those calculations. I would say it's roughly maybe $6 million a year. It's not.
So it basically wouldn't even, it would be like a little red blip at the top.
Yes.
Right, okay.
But if the utility enters into more PPAs, you'll see, further rise. So we did not include the solar PPA in this presentation because it wasn't approved at that point, but now that it's approved, we'll roll that into our calculations.
And so can I follow up just briefly? So what we presented to the city commission as a follow-up to their questions was that it would be less than $9 million a year is what we presented. So $6 million is less than $9 million a year. But the CFO confirmed it would still be treated just like those red bars there, where it would be that red blip as imputed debt throughout the life of that PPA.
There's an imputed debt like that, but does that show up in your balance sheet as a debt?
PPAs are no longer recorded as capital lease under governmental accounting standards, so
that
no.
be, from now on, it's going to be an operating expense?
It's a fuel expense, so
Okay.
I want to make sure I'm clear with that. It's not an operating expense for base rates. It's an expense inside of the fuel expense line item.
So,
Yep.
but it would still show up though as imputed debt?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Claudia, I've got a question. This shows debt right now at 1.6 billion or so, which I think your first slide, if I'm not correct, showed that at 22%, if I'm not mistaken. I think I'm right.
Oh. So you have outstanding debt that the utility owes to bondholders. Bondholders are folks like MetLife, Vanguard, life insurance agencies, they hold the municipalities' debt for various reasons. So that is the debt service. It's sort of like your mortgage, right? So if you have a mortgage for $100,000, you owe somebody $100,000. That 22% that you saw was the mortgage payment. That's the debt service payment to pay back the bondholders. So it's the principal and interest paying the bondholders, but this is the outstanding debt. So this is what's being paid. The debt service is the scheduled payments
Oh,
of
okay,
that.
I misspoke, okay, thanks. And you said we're very heavily leveraged. What would be not heavily leveraged? I mean, would it be 1.2 billion? I don't know, would it be 800 million? Where would people in New York City get real comfortable with the numbers?
So it depends on where you want to be. And I'll go through some of the leverage figures a little bit later. One of the metrics in the financial policy, the debt defeasance policy that was approved last fall, has a debt to capitalization ratio of 70%, and right now the utility is roughly about 86%. Moving from 86% to 70% is just over 300 million of that number, just to get to 70%.
They would be much more comfortable if it came down 300 million.
Probably, but remember, it takes dollars to pay this off. So the dollars come from somewhere, and they're coming from this community. So having to drop that debt over time needs to be measured and methodical as we move forward and try to work that through. So I would say to 70%, let's just call it 320 million. Typically, a utility is somewhere between 40 and 60%. So it's even at 70%, we're still highly levered. I will say that the rating agencies will be happy might not be a good word, but maybe a little bit more positive if we were closer to the 70 than we are at the 86%. So we're moving in the right direction. We are moving in the right direction as far as the debt defeasance piece, but it does take dollars to slow that mountain down. So these are outstanding debt service obligations. So to the question about what this is the principal piece of this. So this is 1.7 billion of principal. There's interest that must be paid on that principal over time, which comes to roughly 2.5 billion for the debt that's outstanding now. Now, granted, we will be issuing new debt in order to continue to fund the infrastructure, so those numbers will move. They will continue to move up until we have the dollars to actually bring that down. So this is actually showing a visual representation. The difference between the blue and the red are future dollars that will be issued. So the debt service that you see, we try to keep it, we call it level, so that you're not having spikes up and down in the debt service. This is GRU's debt history by series. And when I was speaking earlier about the debt that has to be issued every 2 or 3 years in order to fund the infrastructure, I asked to have a projection run through 2030. I wanted to see what it was going to look like by 2030. And when we completed this, I think it was in 2022 when we did this, it's 3.2 billion by 2058. And so that's funding needs through 2030 with debt service through 2058. And I think I've covered a little bit of this. So the outstanding debt began to grow in 2005. This actually has the projects on this particular slide. So the Deer Haven air quality control, the biomass plant brought on, and the biomass PP was bought out in 2018. So back in, I think, 2005 and 2006, as the utilities' debt began to rise, the use of just straight up normal fixed rate debt changed at the utility. They entered into variable rate transactions, and The reason why you would do that is because it lowers your interest cost over time. So they would issue variable rate debt, synthetically fix it out at a lower cost. And that has actually been very positive for the utility. We still have an active variable rate debt program because of that. For example, the new money transaction that we will come back in April, now these are several weeks ago numbers, but we were looking at fixed rate debt over 4% and variable in the 2%-ish range. So you can see the size. 2% may not seem like a lot, but when you're talking about 150 million, it's quite a few dollars. So we, and as a team, actively monitor and manage our debt portfolio. So what that means is if we just had just straight fixed rate debt, we would issue debt when we needed it, and then we'd make our principal and interest payments, and it's simple and it's easier. Because of the size of the debt load and the need to reduce interest cost over time while still funding the utility, we still have a very active variable rate debt program. And so what that means is we monitor the market and we make sure we're actually we pay attention to what's happening, but what we're also looking at on a regular basis is if we have something that we might be able to refund or essentially take out and reissue it at a lower interest rate, that is what we do. So we've come forward with a lot of, I say a lot, and there's been a lot of transactions over the past couple of years doing just that. And so, for example, we would take a look at a series and let's just say at 2008, right? It might be at a 5 or 6% rate. Maybe we can reissue at a 3. That's what we're doing, is trying to drop those interest rates with the outstanding debt. So currently the composition of the debt, the blue portion is the fixed rate debt. The red piece is synthetically fixed and the green is truly unhedged. Apologies, sometimes I have trouble seeing the numbers up there. So the way that the variable rate debt program works, so fixed rate debt is easier, so it's like a mortgage payment, a fixed rate mortgage. So your mortgage might be, I think these days, right around 7%, right? So you make a fixed payment to the bank, and you make a principal payment, and then you're paying 7% in interest. So for a utility, we have the advantage of a tax-exempt market, so the interest rates are lower, but we could also get a lower rate, like I explained earlier, by using a variable rate program. So we typically don't like the risk of just letting the variable rates float with the market, so we do something, we just fix it out. And so it's essentially a swap of interest rates. That's all of this is. It's simple. At the end of the day, it's just swapping an interest rate. So instead of paying this, we're paying this, and we're locking in the interest rate with a counterparty. There is some risk with this, and so we have a team that works on these transactions. It's quite a large team. It's bond counsel, disclosure counsel, the treasury department, the accounting department, budget rates, the accounting and finance director. There are quite a few people that look at these transactions just to make sure that they are we're performing our due diligence and performing those, and we have a financial advisor that takes a look at that as well. The financial advisor works for municipalities, and they have a fiduciary duty to make sure that anything that we are contemplating or performing, that they actually sign off, that it's prudent for us to do so. So there are a lot of, I'm standing up at the podium, I'm not the only one doing this. So just want to give some comfort there. This is a visual representation of the variable rate debt program. So you have GRU, and then we have a bondholder. So we're paying a bondholder a variable rate. We are receiving a variable rate from the counterparty and paying out a fixed piece. So it's just the interest rate swap mechanics working there. When you're in the variable rate market, you need to have what's called liquidity facilities. It's essentially insurance. So if we can't make a payment, this facility would trigger and actually make that payment. This, from my understanding, only happened once back in 2008 when the financial crisis was unfolding. And it wasn't because GRU couldn't make the payment, it was because the market locked up. And so a facility was triggered to actually make that payment. And speaking of that, GRU sets aside funds every month to pay the debt service as it comes due. So every month we're wiring money to the trustee. The trustee is responsible for holding those funds and making those payments to the bondholders. So I described the the history of debt at GRU, talked a little bit about the reserve targets, the cash balance policy that put in place reserve targets back in 2019. And then last fall, the commission put in, approved a debt defeasance program policy plus the metrics, and the board also approved those as well. The history of debt at GRU, it's very complicated, but if you go back a decade, in 2012, the utility completed a debt restructuring, and the debt restructuring was completed to mitigate the bill impacts of the biomass plant coming online. For those of you that are from this area, you probably remember, the fuel costs were projected to be extremely high. So at the time, they had to reduce the base rate portion of the bill, essentially get the bill, to a manageable level. So they completed a 2012 restructuring. In 2019, we had to complete, and this was under my watch, a restructuring to deal with the impacts of 2012. So several years later, we had DIS savings that we had to deal with as far as the 2019 restructuring. The reason why I'm mentioning those two pieces is the debt defeasance policy, that program, is the first of its kind at the utility. So before, it was trying to deal with the impacts of the PPA buyout. And now the debt defeasance policy is now saying, okay, now we're truly going to address the outstanding debt and future debt that's coming into the utility. So first of its kind, we put it in last fall, but we were actually able to start executing back in 2020. So it's been an active program for a couple of years, but we actually just had a policy approved. So the second piece of this, so for 2020, $134 million in savings. At the beginning of 2020, we asked the board and the commission to give us permission to execute a series of transactions, because that was when the pandemic was beginning and the market was just very, very chaotic. And so we were able to execute several transactions for $134 million in savings. General government completed a pension obligation bond transaction that saved GRU $64 million. Those actually formed the floor of the debt defeasance program itself. So those funds are being set aside every year to either defease debt or not have to issue as much debt. As part of those transactions in 2020, as well as the POB, we asked that the commission specifically approve that those go into the debt defeasance program. So we can't change that. That's where those savings are going to go. June 17th, 2021, we were able to execute the first tranche, and $31 million in savings have been accumulated through this point. After the 2012 restructuring, the term DIS savings means that you have lower debt service between 2012 and 2018, and then it started to move up in 2019. When we completed the debt restructuring in 2019, the DIS savings start in 25 and 26. As a reminder of the history of that, when the PPA was bought out, all of the savings for that were returned to customers, which means there was a reduction in the cash that was coming in the utility. And so the restructuring was designed to do that, but it also had a couple of positive benefits. We were able to cash fund AMI and CIS. So those were very good, and it stabilized the cash at the utility. So that's why that first piece there is bonds maturing in 25 and 26. So when you're looking at our debt service and we're talking about 104, 108 million, if you have debt service that's starting to spike up 115, 120, that's a base rate impact or a reserve impact. And so we're always focused on trying to keep that debt service level over time, so as not to have these spikes that are happening inside of the utility, which impacts our customers. So on October 28th, 2021, we executed two defeasances, and you can see 7.1 million and 1.1. So that's fantastic. And then in 2022, it's 3.5 million. So I mentioned this earlier, our modeling with the base rate increases that the board and the commission approved through 2027 and the GFT reductions are going to move our reserve targets above those floors, and we'll start to pull funds off as far as the debt defeasance program. But it's not enough to handle the $3 billion that's coming, and I mentioned that earlier. It takes dollars to really pull that down, and so those are the conversations that we're having now. Part of that debt defeasance policy approval were financial metrics, and it helps with financial goals. When I moved into the CFO role at the utility, one of the first things that I noticed that we didn't have a formal financial metrics policy approved by the commission. It was done internally. And so by having that externally, it creates, buy-in from the commission and the board that these are the metrics that we want the utility to follow. And this is a list of the financial metrics. And I'm going to go a little quick through these next few slides because these are just the calculations. So the question earlier, as far as where do we need to be, so each one of these reflects a metric that we monitor these on a quarterly basis. And when the rating agencies come to talk with the utility, these are the metrics that we are covering when it comes to the financial metrics. If you go down, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like the fifth one down, debt to capitalization, that's the 70% that I was referencing. And so under Fitch's calculation, the utility is 86%. S&P is 80 and Moody's is 77. And so the commission approved the 70% to be the capitalization ratio. So back to the beginning of this, when we're talking about like what would it take to move the 1.7 billion down, roughly about 315 million to get to the 70%. That's across all 5 systems. So that gets us to the 70%, which is still higher than the 40 to 60% range that I was referring to earlier, but it's much better than 86%, and it's definitely a good goal. When the commission approved this last fall, it was a stretch goal. But now with the recent discussions concerning the general fund transfer, the base rate increases, those sorts of things, that stretch goal, we may be able to model it out. It won't be quick. It's not a 1 year, it's not a 5 year, it's several years as far as what that might look like. But having that discussion with JLAC and the 2 charters are talking about what that actually looks like. The commission is very supportive of trying to get the leverage down at the utility. The utility would now have the dollars to deal with the debt. I keep coming back to the dollars because you can't bring that down without cash coming in. And so,
Sorry, Clary, just
yes.
real quick.
When I was a city councilman, we had something like, we had to have 30% reserves for the general fund by state law, state statute. Is there any state statute that says we have to have a certain level of anything?
Not for the utility.
Okay.
So we have the board and commission approved reserve targets. And so
Yeah.
that's what I apologize. That's what I keep referring to. Those are the reserve targets.
Yes,
So
okay.
it says that in 3 sets of funds. So it's operating funds, UPIF, and rate stabilization. So it's 60 days of operating cash, whatever UPIF hasn't been assigned for construction projects.
Yeah.
And the full amount in rate stabilization are the reserves that we need to hold on hand for emergencies and those sorts of things. I appreciate you asking that question. I'm going to segue a little bit. The cash balance policy that was put in 2019, when we put that in, it was for events like fuel costs rising, not being able to bill, receivables that are going higher. So last year, we had these things all occur. The cash balance policy, we're able to trigger it and pull funds out of rate stabilization in order to fund operations. So when we put it in 2019, we certainly didn't know that that was going to happen, but it was so fortunate that we had the foresight to do that because we were able to trigger it and pull cash to actually pay the utilities bills. So it worked as designed, even though we didn't think it was actually going to be triggered when we put that in. So GRU is considered highly levered by all 3 rating agencies. And so we put in these 4 pieces, which I've discussed earlier as far as the elements. And our goal as far as the debt to capitalization is from 80 to 70%, and the leverage ratio from just under 10 to 8. So with that, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Benton for the next portion.
Yeah, just a general, having sat through quite a few of these at this point, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. You started in a rough place, and that we were moving in the right direction. You could choose what you want to answer or defer, but And so what I'm hearing though is that the GRU is now being pushed to go faster. Is that a fair characterization of the situation?
So in order to bring the utilities debt down, it takes cash to do that. The cash to do that, two things are happening. Highly levered and a high general fund transfer. And there are some schools of thought that say the GFT is fine. I referenced that earlier. As a percentage of operating revenues, it's normal. And it is normal,
Right.
except for at a utility, you still have to pay out the debt service. So for several years, and when I ran the calculation a few years ago, I started with 2003, and I think I ran it through 2018, moved it forward through 2027, which was the planning horizon. So over that planning horizon, the utility was paying out more in the general fund transfer than it was earning, of I think $118 million. So that's $118 million that is not remaining at the utility for infrastructure needs. But then you have other things that are happening that are saying we have to keep paying these funds, So two things are happening: highly levered, and the GFT is too high. In order to pay for the GFT and pay for the debt service as it stands now, those are the base rate increases. And so those base rate increases are paying for the debt service, paying for the general fund transfer, paying for all the O&M. And at some point it will shift, so we're over target, so eventually it might bring down some of that debt. But to your question, it's not fast enough because of the base rate increases that are necessary to keep that going. To keep that program going, base rate increases into the far planning horizon are necessary. So the charters are talking about the general fund transfer with the commission to see what that number may need to look like in order to adjust that dynamic. So back to your question. Yes, we were moving in a positive direction, but that slope was still going up with the debt.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and Mr. Chair, I'm going to repeat some of what Ms. Rasnick just kind of addressed. So what happened at the Joint Legislative Auditing Committee is we talked about the plan that we're on with reduction in GFT, modest increases in rates, is basically their feedback was, as she said, not aggressive enough. And so the more aggressive approach is looking at GFT reductions, being more quickly reducing it or further reducing it than the path we were on, looking for any other ways to reduce expenses so that you can apply more to the debt, that debt profile, and start to reduce that debt, as opposed to kind of maintaining or a slow increase is actually get to that level. And so we are working now on a plan for that more aggressive approach to that.
Okay, thank you. And just real quick before Jason, so when you talk about base rate increases, is that customer charge? Is that the base rate of
The base rate
electricity?
increases. It's the 3% in electric through 2027. So a couple of things have happened over the past few years. 2003 to, I might get my years wrong, sorry, I'm working multiple years. Let's just say 2019, the utility overall, when you calculated that overall, it paid out more than it earned. So the commission approved, the board approved 6%, 7%, then the threes, and there was a zero in there because of the pandemic in 2021, and then the threes. And so those cumulatively bring in the revenue dollars to pay the debt service and then to pay the general fund transfer. So the base rate increases are now funding the general fund transfer as it stands.
Right.
So as long as the utility continues to raise rates, the utility can pay the GFT, but it's still not addressing significantly the debt to which the state would like the city to do.
Okay. Jason?
I think I'm following up on that. The math that I'm having a hard time with is all this discussion about, well, let's change the ownership of the utility and so on and so forth. What people in the community are so upset about largely are rates. And so, like, how does the math work that, like, we are able to significantly defease the debt in a way that, like, folks in Tallahassee want to see, and lower people's rates? Like, when I look at the amount of the GFT, if you even wipe that out, I don't see being able to do both those things in any kind of a significant way. So I mean, you know the math better than I do, but it seems to me like people are kind of being sold a bill of goods here. That like I saw somebody on social media, like, you know, like they see like, you know, it's like day one, this thing comes out about the bill and it's going to change the governance of the utility. It's like, yay, you know, we're being delivered. And then day two, it's like, oh, but that's not actually going to affect our rates. So I'm just trying to understand the math here, that, you know, that idea that we can deliver on significantly reducing the debt and reducing people's rates. Is there a path to that logically?
There's a long-term path to that.
Okay.
So that's what we're currently working through. For us to do the modeling, we have to have kind of the bogey. Like, so this is the general fund transfer, either it stays at the amount now or it's lowered, and what does that look like? And then you can run the longer-term modeling. The base rate increases are still necessary to do that unless something else changes. So it really depends on the dollars. It all comes back to the dollars. So once we have a better idea as far as the general fund transfer with the charter discussion and the commission discussion, we'll run those figures. But the base rates, they may be necessary, but we're working through that. It's a $1.7 billion pie that is not going to go away overnight. And it's how do you get there? And then how many years do you want to get there? So is it 5 years? Is it 10? If it's 20? If it's 20, it's a much smaller impact every year. If it's 10, a little bit larger. If it's 5, I wouldn't recommend it. I know I didn't really answer your question, but I don't want to start throwing out numbers while we're still working through the modeling, and the charters are still in discussions about what the general fund transfer may look like, and they still have to get the commission approval on that. So,
And I have a question, again, feel free to punt this one, but it's a question that I get. What would happen if the city sold GRU? You know, where we still have this huge debt, and we're not selling it for the amount of the debt, quite honestly, you know, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Chair, we don't have quick answers to that question. I think what we're focused on right now is how do we respond to the idea of having a more aggressive approach to the debt at the utility, and we're developing plans to get to that. And so, speculation on that I don't think is very fruitful at this point, but I think it is important for us to lay out a very strategic and prudent plan of how do we more aggressively address the debt while recognizing the impact to bills as well. But as Member Foltz mentioned, yeah, I wouldn't.
And it's okay to punt that. It was just kind of like Jason, I get those questions of, wow, this wonderful future where we're FP&L, but not, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but does not, you know, suddenly the city would have a huge debt with no way to service the debt.
FPL would sell all the assets.
So, and again, if you guys don't want to go there, please.
Well, I mean, I just want to say,
put you
we're developing plans right now to address this question. We're looking at how to continue to provide utility services to our community well into the future.
Okay, thank you.
So if I could piggyback on that, I will tell you that GRU, the city of Gainesville, everybody's committed to the utility, right? Maintaining the utility, the infrastructure at the utility. It's incredibly important to this community. It's just how do you work through this from a decades-old decision? And it's a slow and methodical process. You know, the employees at the utility, they're loyal, they're great, they love what they do, and every time I go out to a plant or, you know, take a look at what they're doing, they really care about what they're doing, and they're doing it with the resources that they have. And it can be a struggle, but they do it because they love the community, the utility, et cetera. And so I've had a few conversations with the general manager about this. As we move through this process, the one thing we cannot do is impact the infrastructure to the utility. We cannot do that. So any expense reductions, capital expense reductions have to be looked at in a very prudent fashion. It's for the community that needs the services. It's for the revenues to pay back the bonds. So it's both of those pieces, but we cannot impact the infrastructure either now or in the future. And you've seen that at some places around the state, for example, where their infrastructure wasn't maintained, and then all of a sudden you have issues, you know, major issues. And when you have a major issue, it costs much more to fix than it does to maintain it. So I will always advocate for keeping the infrastructure up to date and in place.
We will support you in that. And again, to repeat what I'm hearing, if we want to drive down that debt, we're going to have to cut expenses such as the GFT, increase revenue. You know, if that's your major focus, dropping rates is not on the table.
We're working through it. I'll segue into this. There are a few more budget sessions. So in April, it's a customer revenue forecast, et cetera. May, we'll be talking about O&M and capital. I think GRUCOM as well, and fuel in May. And so as we're working through the next couple of months, that's what we're working on.
Okay.
But again, the numbers that we work on are all predicated about where we land as far as the general fund transfer. And that's the commissioners and the charters that are working on that.
Great.
Thank you.
Lonnie, one question before you leave. There's no slide on historical debt here. How did GRU get into such a pickle? I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't have this same 86%, right? When did the fit hit the shan? What happened over time to put us in this crummy situation?
Chair. So as I described earlier, this slide shows the history of the utilities debt. Goodness, I think that's back in 1983. And so it stayed pretty much flat, so 235 and then just under 500 million before 2005. The debt started to increase because there was a SAP project, some wastewater type projects. And then when the PPA was contemplated, signed, there were air handling issues out at the Deer Haven campus. So that was roughly 120 million-ish. So the debt started to grow then. So really, the debt started to increase right after 2005. It effectively doubled with the PPA. So that is the history of GRU's debt. It effectively doubled with the PPA of the biomass plant. Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else, Chair? Thank you. So I will turn this over to Mark Benton to cover cash, liquidity, and reserves.
This part of the presentation probably isn't going to make you any jollier than the last one. But this is a recap of what our unrestricted cash looked like from 16 to 22. There's a couple takeaways. First, you'll notice between 16 and 18 there was a dramatic reduction, and then in 22 we had another dip where we had a tough year on the cash side. That dramatic reduction was actually about a 50% drop between those 3 years. It's a $97 million decline. But what was just as troubling was that our forecasts were showing that that decline was going to continue. So we did two things basically to start shoring that up. One was the 2019 refunding transaction that Claudia mentioned, where it infused cash into UPIF and gave us some near-term debt savings from 19 through 24. The other piece was the cash balance study that she mentioned. We commissioned our financial advisor, PFM, to do that study. And it was really a holistic view of all the business risks that GRU faces. And the goal was to identify target cash or reserves that we should be holding for each one of those risks to roll up into a total cash and reserve balance. This table outlines the difference between where our projected reserves are in our modeling today versus those targets that were identified in the cash policy. So in the red, you see where it's done by system. You see where those projected reserves are falling short of the targets. In the black is where it exceeds them. Couple takeaways. You can see in our biggest system in the electric side, for 23 through 25, we're still projecting that we're going to be falling short of the target reserves. That's primarily because we funded from cash, CIS, AMI, and the DH2 gasification. We did that because that allowed us to issue less debt. We paid for it out, out of our equity and didn't have to borrow money for it. The other takeaway is if you go down to the bottom line, there is GRUCOM, and you can see that there are red numbers all the way across the board, reaching $18 million by the time we get to 2027. So that we don't see anything in our short-term or our long-term forecast where that's not going to be the case. Obviously, that raises some issues regarding GRUCOM's viability as an ongoing standalone system. We've talked about a couple of solutions. One is rolling them in as a shared service. The table at the bottom shows the rate impact that's on the other systems that's associated with doing that. I wouldn't pay any attention to that. That was done a year ago. Those numbers are, that rate impact is greater today. We're working on those numbers right now. As a matter of fact,
Going back a couple, the GRU com, is there a specific reason why we are seeing that much, 18 million?
the basic reason is a GRUCOM operation covers for the most part its operating expenses, but it's not covering its debt service. It's got about $54 million in outstanding principal. The revenues that it's bringing in is not sufficient. It's sufficient to cover operating. It's not covering its debt service. It hasn't covered its debt service for some time. That's the principal driving force in why they're not meeting their reserve targets.
So if you could speak to GRUCOM for a second, because I mean, I'm sure some people look and say, well, just get rid of GRUCOM. But what services does it provide that's necessary for the functioning of GRU?
I'm probably not the best person to speak to this, but the GRUCOM, the infrastructure, the backbone is something that we also use at the utility. It's not just providing services, the internet or carriers or the trunking radio system. So the utility needs that backbone, that infrastructure to do its business. So it's not as simple as let's just sell the system. If we were to sell the system, we'd have to lease portions of it back so that we can continue to do our work.
Excuse me. As I remember, when I went out to talk to GRUCOM like that, I saw some slides that said they'd made about, I think their revenues were like $14 million, what do you call it, a year?
I think they're in the 11,
and their
12
expenses were about 9.7, no?
That's not the case. Their revenues are somewhere in the ballpark, in my recollection, of $11 to $12 million a year. And like I said, they're covering their operating expense, and maybe they were talking about a slice of their expenses. What they're not covering are the costs that are below the line.
They're not covering what?
The costs that are below the line: debt service, general fund transfer, UPIF contribution.
But why are they different than anybody else? I mean, everybody else had the same issue.
Well, everybody else has a sufficient revenue stream. Remember, GRUCOM to a large extent, it has to operate as a private concern. It's a market-driven system. They have to compete. The rates that they charge their customers have to be competitive in the marketplace. Our other systems, we set the rates internally. We set the rates to determine and to derive what we need to cover those costs. GRUCOM hasn't been able to do that. The revenues that they're generating from their operations, I don't know any other way to say it, it's just simply they're not sufficient to cover all the costs associated with the GRUCOM system. Now, I will tell you that GRU staff, our financial advisor, and we've engaged some consultants to take a longer look at what GRUCOM's operations look like. We're trying to identify ways to reduce operating costs. We're trying to identify ways to both get more revenues out of our existing lines of business as well as identify new lines of business and look at ways to restructure and generate some more efficiencies. We hope to have bring some of those solutions back in May when we talk to the Commission about the O&M and capital budgets. Claudia mentioned this. The initiatives that were approved as part of the FY22 budget, really, they constitute the foundation for our long-term financial planning. That was that 7% electric base rate that was put in 22, the 3% for 23 through 27, and then the increases in the wastewater rates, as well as the reduction in the GFT. The key to that is that you asked the question about how do we reduce debt? How do we, at the same time, how do we look at even trying to address rates? the changes that were made, in addition to, putting in the cash balance policy, putting in the financial metrics policy and the leveraging policy, these things are all designed to help us generate the revenues that we need to build reserves past those target levels that you saw in that table. What the commission has, what we talked with the commission about is at the points in time when these systems are generating reserves that are greater than what their targets are, that excess piece will be used to buy down debt. If over the long term we're able to meet those myriad goals of reducing debt and doing something with rates, it's going to be a combination of GFT reductions and maybe the significant GFT reductions we're discussing now, base rate increases, using those excess reserves to address rates. But that's the key. Those base rates in combination with the other policy changes we've made have to remain in place for us to at least have the opportunity to make that happen over the long term.
Mark, we have a question from Teresa.
Increase in electric base rate is fiscal year 22. 3% for 23 to 27, is that per year?
Yes, ma'am. It's 3%.
So,
each
and
year.
5% wastewater per year. Okay.
Claudia pointed this out, that the cash balance policy that we put in 19, we put it in there for specific reasons to address the business risk. I'm not sure that we anticipated that we would be putting it into play so quickly, but 22 is a good example of that. We had some anomalies in terms of what hit our cash side. One was the volatility in fuel prices. We paid $71 million more for fuel in 22 than we did in 21. And even though we moved up the millage rate several times during the year, which was painful for everybody, that didn't fully recover those costs. At the end of 22, we still had a $24 million unrecovered piece of that fuel cost that our customers owed to us. Our inventories were higher by about $13 million. Our accounts receivable were higher by about $11 million. But because the cash policy was put in there, as long as the base rate and the GFT reductions, it allowed us to mitigate some of that and allowed us to taper those fuel millage increases that we put in there. Even though they were painful for everybody, we were able not to introduce over a short period of time increases that would have been sufficient to recover that entire $71 million increase in costs. But that's also a stark reminder that if we deviate much from those 22 budget decisions, then it's going to have a noticeable impact on our reserve levels and our leverage ratios. Claudia mentioned that the 70% debt capitalization, it's an aspirational rate, and it is. But if we don't stick to some of the long-term planning we put in there, we have very little opportunity to make not only not to get to that level, but to make progress towards it. Wanted to mention, we put the cash balance policy in place in 2019. PFM is in the process of updating that right now. We hope to have that ready by April of this year. We all suspect that the target ratios are going to rise due to the increased volatility we've seen in fuel prices, things such as more issues associated with cybersecurity. So we'll wait and see what those numbers look like when they come back in April. If you work in the finance department, this is not our favorite slide, but it's a reminder that there are tangible ramifications for deviating from that long-term planning. This slide represents the 5 debt downgrades that we've endured over the last decade, which have cost in total over the next forecasting period. We've estimated about $60 million in cost through the next 25 years associated with this. So it's not just we're not just pointing at things behind the bushes. There are real ramifications associated with moving too far away from what we've put in place for the long-term financial plans.
Tim, you had
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a few questions about the slide and the ratings. First of all, A is not the lowest rating you can get, right? You can go below
Now,
that.
you can go down into triple B, B,
A's
double A.
to the top
It's
tier.
a solid rating, but when we started this process, we were rated in double A by all three rating agencies.
So, and I understand you certainly don't want to drop in the ratings, but so then, and if I'm understanding this correctly, S&P is rating GRU an A, Fitch an A plus, and Moody's a double A.
That's correct.
Negative. So, how does that compare to other utilities in the states? Is there a wide range of ratings? Is it average?
The public power utilities they're all going to be in that same range. Some of them are double A, some of them are A plus, and some of them are A. So we're not that far outside the curve. It's just that the changes that have taken place over the last decade have been expensive for us.
And again, I understand, and I think you can kind of see where I'm going with this, but as painful as it may be for you, these guys who this is what they do, they still seem to think that you've made pretty solid decisions. And would you say that these Moody's and Fitch and S&P know more about the financial stability of a utility than Keith Perry?
Is that a rhetorical question, or you want me to answer that? I will tell you that
Tony's giving you the.
Tony's going in. I will tell you that the rating agencies they're professionals. They're experts in their field. They know what they're doing. As you can see, they don't all agree either. They all have different formulas. They all have different metrics. They have different ways to get there, and they don't work for us. They're an independent entity. Their job is to protect the investors and the folks who buy our bonds, and so they do the best job they can to lay that out.
So, Mr. Chair, what I was going to add is they also identify the areas of concern.
Yes.
And the areas of concern for us are the ones we all are aware of we have a significant amount of debt. We're highly leveraged, so we need to be addressing that. That our GFT is high and it needs to be reduced. So it also is important to look at their guidance as they talk about that, and that it is the same theme that we've talked about from different angles, and it is important for us not to lose sight and to address that and stay on that track.
My apologies. I was asked to actually take a look at this a few weeks ago, and I'm having a little difficulty looking at it on my phone. So I'm just going to give you Moody's, for example. So back in 2012, so the utilities that we looked at were Tallahassee, OUC, JEA, and Lakeland. So between 2012 and 2023, the utility was ranked second out of those four, and now we're fifth. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the result of those 5 downgrades have taken us down from where the utility once was. So yes, it's still strong credit. Investors still want to buy, the debt of the utility, the bonds of the utility, but that when you have that quantity of downgrades in a time frame such as that, it costs the utility more. So it would have cost us $60 to $70 million less at the utility without the downgrades. So to put it in perspective, our capital infrastructure budget is between $75 and $85 million. We could have funded 1 year of capital infrastructure without those 5 downgrades. They started in 2012, right before the biomass plant came online, and it was a result of the 2012 restructuring, trying to deal with the bill impacts because of the PPA. Everything cycles back to the PPA. So the downgrade started with the PPA, and they've continued over time as the utilities have been highly levered. So we focus on this. We are always focused on this. We run the metrics on a quarterly basis just to make sure that we are moving in a positive direction, and the utility is moving in a positive direction from the metrics. But the direction we've now been given is to move faster. And from a rating agency perspective or from a finance perspective, we're happy to hear that, because now we can start to move those metrics. But that's really what you're hearing. Yes, it's strong credit, but it wasn't like it was 10 years ago, and it's costing the utility and our customers money. So I just want to say a few minutes on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
we've got this recommendation up here. This, obviously, this isn't a meeting, and it wasn't a meeting with the commission to take action, but we wanted to reaffirm that basically the message that we're trying to send is that, and this was prior to the advice, we got from JLAC, but the message that we wanted to send was we need to continue to support the initiatives that have been put in place. Like Claudia said, we're making progress. Apparently not as rapidly as some folks would like us to, but we've got long-term financial plans in place. We're moving in the right direction, and we need those. In addition to the policy changes we need those base rate increases to stay in place for us to continue that progress. So that's it.
All right. Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Oh, thank you. Teresa.
I have one other, the base rate increase is coming up. All the other utilities are also increasing their rates. You guys aren't the only one. It's across the board. Because I have 6 different utilities that I work with, and they all have this kind of base rates coming up.
And I just want to say thank you. You guys are dealing with some difficult times. And I don't speak for the entire UAB, but at times we'll say things and ask you questions that should be rhetorical. Just because we're protective of GRU and of the city, and and we're not paid to be here. This is not our day jobs. We're a little freer at times, so please feel free to deflect or to just look away or something when we say something.
We're not worried about answering those types of questions, are we?
Okay. I just again, just speaking for myself, I don't want to add to the burdens you guys are dealing with right now. We're here to support you. So thank you. All right.
Public comments.
Do we have any public comment? I believe we do.
Good evening, Nancy Darren, and unfortunately I'm not prepared very well, but I so appreciate you folks. Thank you very much, and we can all be proud of the efforts GRU has made in difficult conditions. Things that don't, and I don't know if I can use this thing. There are things that we don't seem to bring into the equation that I wonder about quite a bit, is that in 2007, roughly, our revenues went flat because we really took on energy efficiency and conservation in a huge way, dropped our usage from over 1,000 a month kilowatt hours down to 700-800. And we're still in a rate structure that says you burn more, you earn more, and suddenly we chopped ourselves off. The Navigant report from 2013, whenever we did that, talked about a lot of deferred maintenance for many years. And then we had around 2010, and I know Mr. Bilarski used this slide, I have it at home, but rates dropped off a cliff, which is our income. So here we are, we suddenly put all the pollution controls on the old coal plant, which during the coal discussions that we realized there was mercury spewing everywhere. So we spent money on that. We got energy efficient. We suddenly dropped our rates like crazy. We dropped, instead of the reserves we had, and this I'm fuzzy about, but we had built up a bunch of reserves, was my understanding, to deal with the PPA, and that got returned to the people in our pockets. Well, I think we're seeing the results of when you send it individually and it affects a bill in a tiny way rather than really affecting the whole big picture, we have a problem. And I think, and so now rates are a red herring. Rates are not bills. Bills are what freak people out. Bills are what are substandard housing and poverty and elders and all these issues that it's not fair to GRU and our incredible utility to not be discussing this as well. We made a trade-off. We wanted energy efficiency and conservation and healthier homes, and we were giving programs to help low-income people because we have to help the folks who don't have the resources. But housing is 43% of problems. CWC, you know, the community weatherization has proved the power of energy efficiency. But we're in a rate structure that here we are. So I disagree it's all biomass. I think it's a lot of other things, and I hope we have better discussions, and I'm sorry.
Thank you, Nancy. I don't believe we have any other public. Unless anyone else is so moved to speak. Member comments?
Yeah, I just also want to add my appreciation for the two presentations tonight. These presentations are absolutely ideal as a foundation for considering the IRP this time around. And I think that any of our discussions on the IRP have to be set in the context of what we heard tonight.
Thank you. Anyone else? If no one else does, I'll give an update on our recommendation on the natural gas rebates. So Eric and I did presentations, had a very long committee meeting today. I don't know how you guys do it. I would lose my mind. And a lot of good discussion, and basically nothing happened. There was honestly frustrating. You know, there was a motion that took a couple tries to get going to say, well, after the IRP, let's have another discussion of natural gas rebates, and that didn't even pass. So basically nothing happened. So rebates are happening. I think effectively, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Tony, that we'll be talking about natural gas rebates after the IRP is done.
Right, yeah, so just to kind of reiterate what the chair just shared, no motions were made, nothing was passed. So it's continuing as, you know, business as usual, essentially. But we are committed to, after the IRP, is to then answer the question of how does our natural gas system incorporate into the integrated resource plan and our goal of our net zero resolution goal. And so we're going to do that, but we're going to do that after the IRP is complete. We have the answer to that. So it'll be later in 2024.
Yes, Dave.
I just want to say, we've had this conversation a lot. We've talked about it a lot. I've had a particular interest in this topic, and I've asked at numerous meetings if we could be updated when this was going to be brought before the General Policy Committee. And I'm glad you were there today, because the way that I found out that this was going to be on the agenda Tuesday was from a citizen in the community emailing people and saying, hey, this is going to be on the agenda. And that comes from, again, asking repeatedly in these meetings if we could be informed when it was going to be on the agenda, and fearing that that might not happen, monitoring the city commission agendas myself every few days. And as recently as last Friday, I looked at the agendas that were published online, didn't see anything there. And so it's just, to me, and I'm really glad that Barry was there, because it almost just felt to me like, well, GRU feels one way about it, the UAB feels another way about it, so this meeting is going to happen between GRU and the city commission. And I just was really disappointed in that personally.
So, Mr. Chair, I can address that. I gave updates to the UAB that this was going on the General Policy Committee in early March, and I've given those updates since the beginning of the year, because at the beginning of the year they established a quarterly schedule, and this agenda item was on there. It was published. I don't know the exact date. Maybe you can tell me.
They typically publish the agendas 7 days before, so it should have been last Thursday.
So since March 2nd, it was on the notice of meetings and all of that. And again, I've been giving, so in early January, when the city commission adopted their quarterly meeting, The update I gave here was that it's either gonna be in the second meeting in February or the first meeting in March. And then I gave updates that it was gonna be on that it was gonna be the first meeting, the first general policy committee meeting in March. So there was no purposeful misleading or trying to kind of get that through. I verbally gave that update because we've known that since early January. It was going to be on one of those two meetings, and then it was like I said, we published the agenda item at least a week ahead of time. So
Okay, I mean, yeah, and if I misunderstood that, but it seemed to me that it kept getting moved, and I didn't have a definitive sense that it was gonna be on this agenda on this day, or else, I mean, I would have been there myself as well, but I just felt really caught by surprise. I do remember you predicting that it would be on an agenda around this time, and asking for some sort of like confirmation when we knew for sure. And so if you thought that you were communicating that and I just wasn't hearing it, then I'll take responsibility for that. But I have been diligently trying to pay attention to when it was going to come before them so that we could be there.
yeah, so I guess we can communicate better when we have those items, letting the board know when those items are going to there. So when they establish a quarterly plan for general policy committee meetings. And on those quarterly plans, it's not always sure exactly which meeting it's going to be, but they try to, basically they adopt a quarterly plan. Each meeting has agenda items. So when they adopted a quarterly plan for this, I want to say it was late January. I don't know. I can't remember whenever they adopted that quarterly plan. So in early January, we had the discussion of topics coming up. This was put on the list of those topics for general policy. Then they adopt that. But then the agenda is not official until a week before. Then they established that agenda, and that was last Thursday is when all that was uploaded into the system.
But yeah, if we could do a better job, because honestly, I was unclear that I had emailed the mayor weeks ago, and he came back, I think on Monday or Tuesday to me to say, asking should I be presenting? And he's Monday or Tuesday, he said yes, and I still, because I was out last week, still wasn't sure whether we were on the agenda or it was with all the stuff going on.
Yeah, and I will say, with all those things going on, I mean, we have agenda review, I think for this, a week and a half ahead. It's not until then that we really know for sure that, hey, these things are going on there. So like, I think it was the Wednesday, so March 1st is kind of like here's agenda review. We look at the GPC, the General Policy Committee agenda, and the next City Commission agenda, and we look at the items on there. And so nothing is official until that happens, and then it's published the next day, which is the 7 days prior. So at that point, I think what I'm hearing is at that point, we should make sure we send out any items that have gone from the UAB to the City Commission or the General Policy. When that agenda is established, we can send out a correspondence to you all about that. I did not realize that was unknown.
That was the only item that we've had that you all specifically asked us to bring forward. Would you like because every time we bring something to you for a vote and then we take it on to the commission, we always include what your opinion was in that agenda item. So would it be beneficial if I just sent you a copy of each agenda that has, each public meeting agenda, like each city commission meeting agenda and the general policy, and you can see for yourself what's on there? Would that help? I'm sorry that we didn't specifically reach out about this. We have a lot of stuff going on right now, and it's a little hard to get to everything. But if it's helpful for you, I can send copies of all city commission meeting and all general policy committee meetings to you, and that way you can see what's on. Because I send them out to our staff anyway, so that way you can just keep track of what's happening.
Well, and I think not just for us, individually for us, but also I think a lot of us are sort of conduits to the community, and I know I heard from numerous people in the community that felt like, oh wow, this kind of came out of nowhere. Like, didn't really have enough of a sense that, like, even just knowing a week ago, for instance, would have been able to say, okay, hey, you folks that have been expressing interest in this and really care about this issue, like, here's when and where you should be, So
I guess it is in the notice of, it goes in the notice of meetings. I mean, I don't know, you can sign up to get those emails and things like that. It goes in that notice of meetings, but yeah, we did not proactively reach out any different for this item than any other agenda to anybody.
So to Robin's question, do people want to receive those?
Well, I can tell you, we're really interested in the one on raising the salary for UAB members.
Yeah, as soon as we get that one, I'll let.
You mean you raise a zero? Zero by zero is still zero.
Where do we go? So, but on.
Are you getting paid?
No,
Zero.
I get money under the table from FPL.
You're like, hold on a second.
How's the job?
We're still live on camera, so, but yeah, I think in this one, in these kind of cases where it's something, this one was different for us, because this was, we've had very few times where the city commissions had said, please come back and make a recommendation, as opposed to, okay, it's going through you guys first. So that's not to belabor the point. And just a little more context on today's discussion, it was tremendously overshadowed by all the other stuff. I mean, I think it was probably, honestly, DOA. 2 months ago, this would have been a very different discussion. I'm not saying how it would have happened, but it was, yeah, these are bizarro times. So I think that's, with that, next meeting?
The next meeting is your workshop on March 28th, and I believe will have another budget presentation for you.
Okay.
And then the next regular meeting is April 13th.
And there was a discussion of potentially changing all of our meetings. I think you suggested to make these all regular meetings so that we can vote if needed.
It was just a suggestion because, you're meeting twice a month anyway.
Right.
And if we, sometimes it's difficult for us from a timing standpoint to get things in front of you and then get them to the city commission, who's ultimately going to give us our approval. So if we were able to come to you twice a month where you had the opportunity to vote, that would make it easier for us to keep our business flowing. So it's up to you. We could still, I don't think we have that many items that we bring to you, so we could still put some of your work plan items on that workshop agenda, that last agenda of the month, and you would still have an opportunity to work on those things. But just calling it a regular meeting would allow you to vote if we did need to use that time.
No, I think, and I appreciate that. I think it's a good suggestion. Is there anything, who needs to, how do we make that happen?
I think we can just do it. I mean, it's
When you post the agenda, you'll post it as a regular meeting.
right. I would tell the clerk's office to notice it as a regular meeting instead of a workshop.
Would we still meet over there, or would we be doubled up here? Because this is kind of
Yeah,
a mess today.
we could still do it over there. I mean, we wouldn't have to change anything else. We could still have it at 5:30. The rules of your meetings say that you have to meet at least once a month, but it doesn't specify that you can't meet more often. So having that second meeting as a chance for us to get more items in front of you would really be helpful.
And we've hit those cases where it goes to the city commission before, just because of the timing, so it gives us a little, I don't see a downside, but we're open for discussion if you guys have any. That would be great. Thank you.
that's what we will do moving forward then? Is that right?
Yeah, if you're all in agreement, sure.
Can you make sure when things are sent out that you send emails to the personal email address?
I try to do that every time, and I looked back in my emails. I did forget to copy your regular addresses this time, and I apologize for that. But I do try every time to always copy both your GRU emails and your regular emails. So.
Okay, good.
Seeing nothing else, I think we will adjourn the meeting.